to settle down, please, and keep your devices on silent mode. Esteemed participants, very good morning to all of you, and a very warm welcome to the Parallel Session 2 on Day 2 of the 6th International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Today, we embark on a crucial discussion revolving around the theme Unbundling Risk in Implementation and Investment by the Private Sector in Transport Resilience Projects. This session aims to capture the perspectives of different stakeholders in understanding the enablers and hindrance factors for private sector engagement in transport resilience projects. Please join me in welcoming on stage our esteemed moderator, Mr. Shobik Ganguly, to guide us through this insightful discussion. Shobik is an experienced development and finance professional in infrastructure and climate sectors, with significant exposure to policy, investment programs, and transactions. In the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, he leads programs on climate finance, private investment in infrastructure, and resilience. With their vast experience and knowledge, we are confident that our moderator and the panelists will facilitate a dynamic and enriching conversation. Shobik, I now hand over the conduct of this session to you. Please invite the panelists on stage. We eagerly anticipate the valuable insights that will unfold under your guidance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a mix of virtual and in-person participation in the panel today. The first panelist is joining us virtually, Ms. Jen Jengwin O, Practice Manager, Transport, South Asia region from the World Bank. Can we have her on screen, please? Hi, Jen. I can't see you, And our next panelist joining us in person is Mr. KJ Devasya, Assistant Vice President, Enterprise Risk and Corporate Resilience, Bengaluru International Airport Limited. Welcome, Mr. Devasya, please. Our third panelist joining us virtually is Ms. Regina Asaritos, Chief Policy and Legislation Section, UNCTAD. Regina, I hope you're on screen. Hello there. Our next panelist is Ms. Titi Tutuvanu Schwalger, former CEO, Land Transport Authority, Samoa. She's joining us in person. Welcome on stage, Titi. Our next panelist is also joining us in person, Mr. Ede Ijaz Vasquez, Senior Advisor on Sustainable Development, Infrastructure, Climate Change, and Finance. Welcome, Ede. And our last panelist for this panel is Ms. Annika Zawadzki, Managing Director and Partner, BCG. She's joining us virtually. So thank you so much, all the panelists, for joining us this morning. Before I start the discussions, I just wanted to sort of lay down the rules of this discussion. We have about 75 minutes, and we want to have around 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. So I'll request in the first round of discussion that every panelist who I direct the questions to limit the responses to 2 minutes each, which will give us a time to come back again for a second round of questions. And at the end, I'll try and summarize the discussion and ask the audience member for questions. And since we are in the middle of, we are with so many esteemed panelists, and I also want my time in the sun, I'll start with a short overview of what I think is the context for private investment in resilient transport infrastructure. So transportation infrastructure is the economic backbone of any country. I mean, it provides access to economic activities, livelihoods, healthcare, emergencies, everything. When a climate event happens and a transport linkage is disrupted, it not only affects the infrastructure itself, but it impacts the economy as a whole. I mean, very simplistically, supplies reduce, prices increase, and economic activities go down. Due to the heavy economic costs at stake, resilience in transport infrastructure merits specific policy attention by all policymakers. The complication comes from various approaches that can be taken to use private investment in resilient transport infrastructure. Now, you can integrate resilience when you're building a new infrastructure, like a new airport, for example. You can integrate resilience by retrofitting existing infrastructure by, for example, building slope protection on a mountain highway. Or you can integrate resilience to a transport corridor by adding another facility, like adding a flood protection along with a railway line kind of thing. Add another layer of complexity is the economic dividend of resilience. We've heard speakers talk about how $1 spent on resilience today avoids between $4 to $12 in the future from costs of rehabilitation and reconstruction. But that's over a 30-year period of time. That's over the full life cycle of the asset. So where do you try and unbundle risk for private investments in transport infrastructure? Another layer of complexity is that we have different classes of infrastructure investors from private sector. Some who invest in construction, some who invest in operation and maintenance, and some who invest in operating assets. So we hope to sort of demystify these layers of complexity in private investment in infrastructure through this discussion. So let's begin. And my first question of the day is to Ms. Jain. In this, the complexity that I laid down, how do you see the policy landscape for private investment in resilient infrastructure, especially in transport, focusing on the Southeast Asia region? How do you see opportunities panning out?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in this esteemed panel. I hope you are.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity to join this esteemed panel. And indeed, this is a topic that is of significant importance for us at the World Bank as we engage in the development of transport sector. In fact, ensuring the climate resilience and adaptation is really front and center and at the core of all our engagement, policy engagement, as well as the investment program that we are carrying out in South Asia region, as well as in other countries around the developing world. As you pointed out, investment in resilience to enhance the climate resilience and adaptation faces significant challenges. First of all, the volume of financing that goes into is inadequate. In fact, there is a significant financing gap that is experienced worldwide, especially in the most vulnerable countries and developing countries that are in need of the greatest amount of financing because of their level of exposure. So, for example, in 2021 to 2022, globally, about $1.3 trillion of global climate finance has been mobilized, but only 5% has been on adaptation. The rest went to the mitigation. This represents a financing gap of $200 to $400 billion a year for adaptation. This significant gap in the financing is related to what has just been laid out in terms of the complex landscape, in terms of the infrastructure class, different interventions that are needed towards climate adaptation and resilience. Unlike the mitigation sector, the adaptation and resilient activities are highly context specific. And also the development of the taxonomy to classify the types of investment, whether they are, qualified as adaptation and resilience, is significantly underdeveloped. So because of these gaps, we also have a measurement issues because some private asset owners and they may make their own investment to improve the resilience of their own assets. but these are not also adequately captured. In the absence of these definitions and taxonomy, it is difficult for private investors, institutional investors, capital market players to really direct their resources in a systematic manner to activities that would strengthen the adaptation and resilience. And of course, there is a misalignment issue. As you mentioned, there is a long-term nature of the returns from these investments, and also the lack of financial returns, lack of defined financial returns over this long-term horizon, really creates an environment where private sector investment is difficult. And also because of the climate change poses a severe risk at the same time, comes with a deep uncertainty. And in many of the developing countries, we have gaps in understanding the risks and the damages in the future in the longer horizon due to the lack of data and proper analytics. So in this context, while most of the investment that are going into the adaptation resilience will generate the economic return, but their financial return in concrete term will be difficult to measure. So these are, three dimensions. So in insufficient volume, inadequate framework and definition, and also misalignment of the incentives are posing significant challenges to the policy environment. So therefore, it is important to tackle these issues, strengthen the regulatory framework, policy definitions, and strengthen the government capacity to be able to undertake data and analytics in this field. And also coming up with the new financial instruments and incentive mechanisms to better align the economic returns coming from these investments with the financial returns, and pooling the risks and mobilizing financing based on risks will be an important focus going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So moving on from the policy perspective, and Jen spoke about policy need for policy frameworks and capacities. Coming to the private sector, Mr. Devasya, what do you think are the primary enablers and bottlenecks for private sector investment in resilient infrastructure, especially in the aviation sector?
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to share the thoughts with me in this larger audience and August gathering. The question is something very relevant today because India, precisely India, not only India, everywhere, we see that trend actually, but precisely in India, privatization in aviation or in other transport industries are actually getting more emphasis and significance. If you look at aviation sector alone, the number of private airports in India are very limited even today. Out of the 40 plus operational airports, we have less than 25 private airports. Okay, of course, but we are still there because although it is too late, we are still there because a lot of metro airports, big airports, larger airports are actually privatized and it is running good. Some of the things which maybe I can put it as enablers or something like that for in the aviation sector privatization is maybe the one or two important points in the initial comments. If I say that, it will be the long-term arrangements actually, okay? Because we are investing a lot of money and in the new privatization policy, whatever the existing currently going on policy, a larger investment comes from the companies who are going to promote it actually, and we are something around millions of billions of rupees are spent there actually, and it should be for a long term. We call the PPP, public-private partnership. That concession agreement ideally should not be less than 30 or something like that in the phase one. Or if you look at in international sector, wherever the privatization, People even ask for 99 years of lease or the concession agreement is actually like that. Why? Because we can invest with the confidence, we can invest with the all parts or all aspects like resilience or a risk management system, everything in place. If that kind of an arrangement is not there, then people will be a little reluctant to invest a huge amount of money because we do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. Come to aviation, the return of investment. I heard Mr. Jen also mentioning about actually the return ROI is a little bit of unpredictable. Okay, but at the same time, that can be made predictable when we have long-term arrangements actually, because the master planning or the passenger footfall planning what we do, that we are not doing for just 1 month or 6 months or 1 year, we are doing it for a couple of dozens of years or something like that actually. Another one most important enabler is actually easy to do the business. Mostly it goes into the regulations actually like that, okay? It has got a plus and minus. Sometimes it works as challenge, sometimes it comes as an enabler. Because the regulations, if keep on changing after the investment. Okay, we invested, we pledged, after that the regulation changes. Then it is very difficult to do the business. But if the appropriate regulations in favor of such investment is there, then we can confidently go and we can a stable political, geopolitical situation contributing to the regulation change actually, or impacting or something like that. Why the regulation keep on changing? Because the geopolitical situation changes, something of like that. So mostly in the first round, if I just give 2 points actually, I can say that a long-term partnership or a concession agreement, we call it in our language, that will be one of the enabler, or addition to that, the regulatory framework, where a stable geopolitical situation contributing or complementing to a firm and favorable kind of regulatory framework.
Thank you, Mr. Devasya. So what I hear from you is basically there is an economic dividend of resilient infrastructure, but you need enough time to actually get that dividend.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. Going from airports to seaports, Regina, the next question is for you. What are the barriers and opportunities in mobilizing private investments towards climate-resilient maritime transport infrastructure?
Good morning to everyone from Geneva. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I work for UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And just following on some of the very considerate comments of my co-panelist, Ms. Jen, let me just start basically with the barriers. First of all, of course, there are competing priorities. There are just competing priorities for funding altogether. And very importantly, a lack of awareness that climate risks for ports are actually business risks. They're often just considered as environmental risks and sidelined in a sense. But in effect, the costs of inaction far outweigh the costs of adaptation. These costs of adaptation don't, in all cases, have to be capital intensive. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. Altogether, I think one of the barriers is considered adaptation is not considered a priority for investment. There's also the aspect of risk sharing, because in many cases, how is adaptation finance going to be applied? It's going to be in the form of a public-private partnership, an agreement effectively to build and maybe run a facility. And in this context, there's of course a need to commercially, as part of this contract, this agreement, to allocate the potential risks, climate risks. And as these are more likely to materialize in the future, there's of course the risk or the danger that the investor will not want to carry this risk, and that will all be on the taxpayer, which is a problem because the public side, the governments, for example, they obviously want to attract this investment. That's something we've been highlighting as important to observe in driving private finance. The insurance industry, for example, itself is reducing its climate risk exposure, but what that effectively means is that they're not taking on climate risk. So these are certainly barriers in practice. In terms of opportunities, there are some on a practical level. I mentioned already relatively small design changes, which may not be capital intensive, which could be taken. And also what has been termed by the former Secretary General of the International Association of Ports and Harbors, piggybacking, where he said whenever an investment is planned, excuse me, infrastructure investment is planned, to piggyback climate resilience on, in other words, to just adapt it and to improve the functionality under climate change of this planned infrastructure over its lifetime. Certainly, there is a need for a change of perspective to get away from the idea that adaptation is a matter of just costs, because effectively every society, every company is free to redirect its investment priorities, and redirecting in the direction like green investments. The same is true for adaptation. So one of the opportunities is to change the mindset, if you will, and to consider adaptation not strictly a cost factor, but just a redirection of investment priorities. Other than that, two sets of opportunities we see are in terms of developing and implementing effective policies and especially legal frameworks that require risk assessment. Because then you can integrate these considerations throughout a project planning and development cycle. An example is in the European Union, where there is legislation having, on the basis of legislation, normative technical guidance has been developed for the climate proofing of infrastructure, and that needs to be applied in all 27 EU member states as part of environmental impact assessments for all larger infrastructure projects like ports, public and private, in the EU, and also for EU-funded projects in third countries. So that is something to create a level playing field and help mainstream climate resilience in investment planning. And finally, just to conclude this, we know that funding is paramount for effective adaptation. And one possibility that could be considered is to reinvest proceeds from financial instruments related to greenhouse gas emissions control in shipping within the industry for the purpose of effective port adaptation in developing countries. So in other sectors, in air and road, etc., you somehow have some kind of investment into the maintenance of infrastructure. You don't have that with sea, with maritime infrastructure that much, and a relatively low-hanging fruit in this respect, and that is something that developing countries would have to push for at the IMO, where these discussions are ongoing. This had been proposed in 2011 at an expert meeting we held, and was supported at the time by the International Chamber of Shipping. But the discussions at the IMO on market-based measures for greenhouse gas emissions stalled. They've picked up again, so that is actively under consideration. But if some of these funds, they will be considerable, could be dedicated to strengthening climate resilience of ports in developing countries, that would be a win for all, because shipping needs ports. So this is really a thought that is worth, I think, promoting. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. And you made a very, very important point that a lot of investment is already happening. So you need to make tweaks in the investment that's already happening to make climate-proof the infrastructure that's being created. Maybe a low-hanging fruit could be tweaking the design of the concession agreements, making the private sector responsible to make those design changes as part of the investments. On that point, let me go to Titi. So from airports to ports, back to land. In your experience, how has private sector leveraged its capacity to manage climate risks?
Thank you, Shaubik. Talo Falava, Namaste. I'm Titi from Samoa, and for those of you who may not know where Samoa is, it's one of the Pacific Island countries. with a population of 200,000. So it's not a big country. So it's, as you can tell from its population, the private sector or the companies that are involved with transport and infrastructure sector in Samoa is not that many. And I think one of the few things that the private sector in Samoa has done well or have improved on in managing climate risk is they have definitely improved their preparedness for emergency response. So Samoa being one of the SIDS countries, we're very vulnerable to landslides, flooding, cyclones, and they are occurring more frequently than ever. And we've seen that our contractors have really improved on their emergency response. Because you will see that these are the same companies that work for roading projects. They also work for the airport projects, the water, electricity, and so forth. So obviously, if there's a huge natural disaster in the country, it's the same companies that would have to be spread out throughout the country. So I think that's one thing that our private sector have improved on. Another one is our local contractors have really worked hard to enhance their capacity to bid for climate resilience projects. So, our economy or our local government budget, we can only afford much of the maintenance and a little bit of our capital work projects in the transport and infrastructure sector. So we're heavily reliant on our multilateral and our bilateral partners, and our multilateral partners being the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, even the government of Australia. And so we rely on their grant funding for us to improve the resilience of our infrastructure. And in order for our local contractors to win those jobs, they have to enhance their capacity to be able to win those jobs. And this has been a success through close working collaboration between the government of Samoa as well as our private sector. Because a lot of the how the projects are designed, how the eligibility or the qualification requirements for our contractors, it's the government that is sitting and negotiating with the donors to set these. So our local contractors have started, enhancing their capacity in this area. I'm currently working on a decarbonization project in the land and maritime transport in Samoa. And one of the solutions to, to decarbonize or reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Samoa is e-vehicles. However, our private sector has to, get training and get themselves, get capacity building to be able to maintain these e-vehicles. So it's a work in progress. We still have a lot of work to do, but yeah, these are just some of the things that we've done well so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. And you raise a very important point about the capacity of the private sector. And Mr. Devesiya spoke about really long-term concessions. But to predict the risk during that long-term concession by the private sector, the capacity of the private sector needs also strengthening. And it's both parties. So we heard Jen and Regina talking about the policy strengthening and capacity building of the government side, but private sector side is also very important. My next question is to Ede. Do you think private investment has made a measurable impact in the resilient infrastructure space globally? And how do we even measure that?
Sure. No, look, let me start with a couple of numbers that I found while preparing for the panel. I look at the public-private infrastructure database that looks at what are the investments. First semester of last year, which is the latest numbers, well, guess what? The commitments went down by 7% compared to the previous year. And for the first time in many years, transport lost the first sector position. Now, renewable energy private investment is higher than on transport. So this is a cause for alarm. Everybody in this audience needs to figure out how to increase that process because there's not enough funding. Now, the second, I want to make 3 points today. First, at the Global Center on Adaptation, we did a review of PPP contracts for infrastructure. And we were shocked that there are no clauses on what to do with climate-related risks. Okay? So it's like closing your eyes and hoping for the best. It's like looking for force majeure when those disasters, and that means that nobody wins. You as an operator of the airport, as soon as you get flooded the airport, then you're going to be losing revenue. And the government and society is going to lose massive economic benefits into this process. So by not having that clearly in the contract, everybody loses, right? And remember, these concessions, as you were proposing, 30 years, you're going to see an important change of climate during that period, and therefore it needs to be analyzed, that process. Now, you need to move away from this belief that you are resilient or not resilient. It is how much money you want to invest for what level of protection in that process. And therefore, the contracts need to come and say, look, this is how the contractor needs to analyze. These are the standards that we're looking for. An example is the Inter-American Development Bank was financing an intercity rail between cities in Sao Paulo. And the Sao Paulo government said, okay, whoever is going to be it needs to come with the best solutions to deal with these two climate scenarios. IPCC super bad, IPCC medium, and you need to be in the middle, so come and send us design. What does that trigger is that then the bidders are going to be creating and figuring out what's the lowest cost to achieve that level of resilience. But then there's also saying, look, this also means that at a certain point, certain climate shocks are going to overwhelm the asset. And therefore, what portion is going to go to insurance that needs to be bought, what portion is going to be force majeure, and what does the government need to take into that process. Allocation of risk, which is PPP 101, the most practical, needs to happen on climate. Second, I want to emphasize what Titi was saying. We tend to think that this is just a relationship between investor and the government, but you need the whole private ecosystem having an understanding. The design, construction companies, the construction supervision engineers need to understand this process. Okay, the operators need to figure out what to do into that direction, but also the users. Because we also tend to think that this is just an issue for the assets, but it's also the users. You need to strengthen the resilience of the asset users. So logistics companies need to understand that imagine there's a concession in PPP for a road, and there are going to be always at some point certain emergencies that is going to happen. How do they communicate with logistics company? How do they define alternative routes? How do they minimize the impact on breaking on the operation of the assets to reduce the economic impact? It's not only the construction, it's not only the standard, it is the operation and the preparedness for those disasters that need to be also part of the contract. And then I'll conclude with a thought that really that alliance and bringing the users into this conversation is going to be critical. Because, for example, when you're going to be having failures of a transportation system or failures of a port or failures of an airport, and then have that preparedness, not only to be able to tell the users this is what is happening, but also to strengthen the capacity of those users to also figure out what to do. For the companies that are going to be shipping their goods, having a contingency plan if this happens, because you know every year these roads are going to have landslides. How do you go around that process? Right. So expand the definition of resilience from design to operation to engagement with the users. Thank you.
Thank you, Ere. That was very, very insightful. And my final question in this round is to Annika. And what we're looking from you is a more strategic perspective, the big picture. And we heard from Jen and Regina that there is a significant financing gap for resilient infrastructure. What do you think can be very long-term strategies for mobilizing private investment at scale to resolve the gap?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me together with my esteemed fellow panelists, and greetings from Munich. We work a lot with public sector, but also private sector and in the intersection of private-public partnerships. Coming back to your question, yes, to start with, there are already large investment needs in the transport sector just because of population growth, economic development, urbanization, and modernization needs. And on top of this comes now the crucial and time-sensitive need to make infrastructure resilient. According to UNEP, we will need a yearly investment in adapting infrastructure of 56 billion in developing countries alone until 2030. And currently, public finances take up about 98% of the AR financing flows, including DFIs and governments. Given the daunting investment needs, the private sector needs to step up significantly and, increase their investments. And if we look at the private sector, for the private sector to get involved, however, we need to create transparency on two factors, and one has been named already, both of them have been named by my fellow panelists. One is clearly define a resilience taxonomy to harmonize approaches to AR financing across government actors, financial markets, and economy sectors, such as infrastructure. And the taxonomy should clearly define which project and which solution adds resilience to a sector and which not, and thus function as a basis for investment decisions. We are currently engaged in a partnership with the Climate Bond Initiative to develop and road test such a resilience framework with corporates, sovereign issuers, and financial institutions. Second, the cost of inaction for the private sector are extremely drastic. Therefore, channeling resources towards protecting their portfolios and their assets and supply chains offer high return. It is estimated that we can expect on average $4 return on every dollar invested, considering also broader economic and societal effects of infrastructure disruptions. At last year's COP, BCG has published a report with USAID as a response to the US President Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience call for action. And the report doubles down exactly on the business case for the private sector and identifies three key opportunities for private investments. First of all, it's all about protecting value. Companies can and should safeguard value at risk and protect their assets, supply chains, and operations through AR measures. Second, there is a high opportunity to grow. Companies can, and in my opinion, should invest in developing new AR products and services because someone has to develop and provide that, creating climate resilient revenue streams and thereby capitalizing on the really growing market as companies and governments are increasingly recognizing the imperative to act. And last, but not least, it's opportunity to participate through public-private public-private collaboration. So private and public sectors can collaborate to finance and implement capital projects as AR measures will protect both businesses and vulnerable communities alike, for example, with a seawall.
And that sort of rounds off our conversation in the first half of this panel discussion, and where we heard about a lot of ideas, a lot of approaches, a lot of directions through which governments can intervene to improve private investment in resilient infrastructure. The next round of questions will have an overarching theme of what can different institutions, entities, both private sector and public sector, can do to sort of roll out these approaches. So on that theme, my first question in this round is to Jen. What is the potential role of multilateral institutions like the World Bank or CDRI to drive the infrastructure agenda leveraging private investment, given what you heard so far?
Thank you very much for this question. Definitely, but before we go into the specific actions, how we can unlock the private sector financing into strengthening climate resilience in transport sector, I want to highlight that we also need to work with the public sector. So there are largely three things that we need to work with in private sector, public sector strengthening, which we are incorporating in our engagement with the the government of India and state level government when we work on the transport projects. So As earlier mentioned, we need overall stronger institutional capacity in bringing in more systematic approach to these risks and the response to these risks. This involves the technical standards of the infrastructure projects and bringing in cost-effective solutions to the various risks that face transport infrastructure in India or broadly South Asia and developing world are faced with. Because it's not always the expensive engineering solutions that brings the best returns. So there are many different cost-effective measures, better decision-making process that involve the community, nature-based solutions. So there are this broad spectrum of the measures that can bring the outcomes. And the public institutions' capacity and also more broadly, the construction industry and an ecosystem need to strengthen their technical capacity in understanding these different cost-effective measures. And by bringing in this pilot implementation where we implement the cost-effective system-wide solutions, we can also establish the database and track record of how much does it cost to prevent the future risks in particular types of infrastructure. That the accumulation of the knowledge and the data will strengthen the public institutions' capacity to better respond. And as I earlier also mentioned, really strengthening the data, understanding the granular, collecting and maintaining the granular data about the what is happening, the meteorological, hydrological, geological information, and integrating them for the decision-making process will be crucial. Other panelists mentioned, measures such as PPP and risk sharing, but we need to first understand the risk to be shared between public and private. And understanding risk comes from this good data and analytics. So those are some technical assistance that we are also trying to provide in addition to the cost-effective measures in infrastructure design and implementation. Beyond that, what we are also working on is many of us discussed the risk allocation, the understanding the risk. And there's so much that can be done in terms of the financial solutions, how we can allocate the risk. PPP contract obviously isn't one option, but other forms of long-term contracts address this issue of the misalignment of the issues, and then we'll support the risk allocation. Say if we have a long-term contract and the private sector operator is responsible for maintaining and operating that asset for a longer period of time, and provided that there is a good data that allows them to predict the future risks, they will try to optimize the life cycle cost and the risks associated with that infrastructure. So using these longer-term contracts smartly would be an important measure that we are also supporting the government to implement. Taking a bit broader approach, going beyond these individual projects, we are also working to create these markets, right? So this is a market that is at the early stage of development. But we can do so much more in creating the financial market to better respond to this. For example, we can strengthen the ESG financing. So there are the funders and financials that are out there that are interested in these goals. But again, because of the issues related to the taxonomy and overall institutional framework, regulatory framework, this ESG financing is not sufficiently directed to the climate resilient goals. So creating that framework is something that we can work on. And climate disaster is highly uncertain. There's a deep uncertainty. And when it happens, it is focused on particular geographical area, and the consequence of that individual event is large. But it's highly disproportionate. So it's concentrated in one area. It's not felt in entire country. So it is also important to pool the risk and create funds such as disaster reserve fund or other forms of fund where we are able to pool different resources as well as pool different risks, and then be able to allocate fund where these severe events occur. Then, this is an insurance mechanism, but really deepening the existing market structure that the insurance that are out there with the power of data and analytics and institutional structure, and by developing the market, we can better direct these resources and address this risk in the pooled manner through these funds where everybody chips in. So 3 areas, again, policy and regulatory framework, project level technical capacity building, and creating market are some of the areas that we are focused on, and we continue support our client countries in strengthening these areas. Thank you.
A small request, can we just limit our responses to 2 minutes each if we want some time to have questions. So I know this discussion can be very interesting and insightful. We can have hours of discussion on this, but please limit your responses to 2 minutes to have some time for a discussion. My next question is to Regina. In scaling up adaptation-related climate finance for seaport resilience, what role can private sector play, especially for SIDS? And what are some of the issues that UNCTAD have been highlighting in this regard?
Thank you very much for the question, and you are right. There are many, many things to say, and I'm very happy to be in a panel with so considered contributions. Well, SIDS, small island developing states, as the lady on the panel in the room has said, they're at particular risk. SIDS are highly dependent on ports as lifelines, literal lifelines for all their trade, energy and food security, and tourism. And also in the context of disaster risk reduction and disaster response and recovery, of course. At the same time, they're amongst the most vulnerable to climate change impacts as they're exposed to worsening hazards, but lack the capacity to respond. So while all ports are at some and growing risk of climate change impacts, certainly for SIDS, that is very much amplified. We've been working for over 15 years on the broader issue of climate change impacts and adaptation for ports, including in collaboration with a very broad range of partners. And some of this research under a technical cooperation project, SIDS Port Climate Adapt, which focused on the Caribbean, and was carried out with modeling from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. We actually established, so this is one of a few quantitative studies and has informed the IPCC reports, that critical coastal transport infrastructure like ports and airports in SIDS face a high and growing risk of coastal flooding, even at 1.5 degrees, which, as you know, we are expecting as soon as from the end of this decade. So with the pun, practically next Wednesday. I mean, it's very, very soon, in the absence of effective adaptation measures. And that has huge implications for the sustainable development prospects of these vulnerable nations who are already facing a COVID-19 related debt crisis. They're amongst the most affected by the COVID costs or the economic fallout. And they're also often in the so-called middle income trap, so not eligible for concessional loans. We highlighted in a policy brief published in 2022 how important improved access to affordable adaptation finance is for ports in developing countries, especially in the most vulnerable, such as SIDS. and that includes funding in the form of grants rather than loans. That is in line with what our member states have said, the UN member states, in the Bridgetown Covenant, which is the outcome document of the last UNCTAD conference. And the role of the private sector is particularly important in this context because of the huge public investment gap. We've heard already several figures cited. UNEP adaptation gap report, the latest one, estimates that adaptation costs in developing countries are 10 to 18 times greater than current public adaptation finance flows. And we don't really see a sign of a change in focus to increase this. But of all the climate finance by public finance provided by developed countries, only 34% was for adaptation, and thus the overall in 2022 was 28.6 billion. Now, that's not a lot overall, but only a fraction of this amount will have been targeting climate change adaptation for ports and other critical infrastructure. So you can see how large the gap is. And in the absence of adaptation, effective adaptation, the sustainable development prospect, but also the existing sustainable development gains of these countries are at severe risk. So just to conclude, I think in the light of what is at stake, and also in the light of infrastructure lifespans, it's quite appropriate to say failure is not an option and time is of the essence.
Thank you, Regina. Failure is not an option. That puts the stark scenario in perspective. My next question is to Ede. So we've spoken at length about the public sector and the private sector. What about the contribution of research institutions, think tanks, data repositories? How can they play a role in enhancing the flow of private investment?
Absolutely. And so I sat down as I was preparing for the panel and I had like 20 things. So don't worry, I'm not going to tell you 20, I'm going to tell you 4. First, a lot better data, risk assessment, methodologies, risk approaches. I think that's a really important activity for the research institutions and that. I'll make a pitch for the Global Resilient Infrastructure Report of ICDRI that really brings some of the best data globally into this process. That kind of thing, fundamental. Second, we talk about the need for the whole private ecosystem to build the capacity as a second really important area. The more that you have designers, constructors, operators, construction supervision, all of those, understanding the risk and being able to figure out what to do collectively, critical. Number 3, the association of users of this infrastructure. Association of freight truckers, the association of engineers, the association need to take a more proactive role to engage with the public and the private sector to say, let's get serious about resilient infrastructure to this process. And the final one is civil society organizations really need to be more engaged as there is a public discussion about PPP contracts to begin to say, look, we are paying for this, for the public contributions through our taxes and our user fees, and therefore there's a responsibility to make sure that climate risk and other risks are mainstream into these contracts. 4 points.
All right. Thank you, Ede. I owe you a beer for being short. Yeah. My next question is for Tithi. International partnerships and collaborations and basically regional and global networks are essential for building global resilience. How has Samoa leveraged some of these networks?
As I've mentioned in my previous response, so at least 50% of the donor funding from World Bank and Asian Development Bank that comes into Samoa goes towards transport and infrastructure resilience projects. To obey your time frame you've given, one way for it's a collaborative approach. Starts from government. To push and promote, with the multilateral partners, to make sure that there's local participation, use of local people and local contractors in the implementation of these climate resilient projects. At the same time, the multilateral partners you know, you know, we keep saying, oh, we want to use the local people and nature-based solutions, but it does not exactly translate into implementation. And one thing is, you know, for example, the qualification requirements for the private sector, it does not necessarily promote the use of local companies. So this is something that needs to be looked and improved on. And then also for the private sector, in order for, you know, for our donor partners to have confidence to keep giving grants funding and funding towards our local companies, is that they need to do their job. They need to deliver a work that is compliant to standards, and that you know, gives the confidence for the donor partners to keep donating more. So thank you.
Thank you, Titi. My next question is for Mr. Devasya. Now we know, and we've heard in the discussion also, that the private sector is innovating, right? There is financial costs involved in climate events, and we've seen some private sector innovations. For example, in India, airports are using building information modeling and other technologies for designing resilient structures. How can that knowledge and innovation be shared with the public sector to enhance the public sector's capacity?
Yeah, thank you. I see the screen that time's up actually, so I will be
No,
very...
just ignore that. Yeah.
Okay, fine. See, couple of things before that actually, like when we speak about resilience, when we speak about the capacity, we strongly believe it is not the buildings or the space making it, but the technology. And best example is the aviation sector. Probably I can take my own airport. We started the airport with a 6 million capacity, and it has gone to 35 million in the 10-year span. Okay, can we build structures and something like that and make only terminal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? It's not possible. So how the capacity enhancement as far as the volume is concerned, that is technology, innovation and digitalization. And that's one of the important thing. It's not making the buildings or the space expansion or something like that. When it comes into the other set of capacity is actually this technology knowledge needs to be transferred or shared with the other peer groups and everything like that. What's the limitation we find in India precisely, but in this sector is actually there is no standard way of knowledge sharing or probably best practice sharing with the other entity, because every airport or every airline is an entity and is actually an autonomous way of functioning, while there is a broader framework. The framework which exists, that may be the guidelines of the civil aviation authorities or the International Civil Aviation, ICAOs or SCI kind of an organization. But it is still, freedom is too much there with the airport to execute, opt it or go it for or something like that. Standardization of the practices, if not exactly pinpointing, at least the broader guidelines, so that all will be doing. Sustainability, best example. Some airports doing good efforts, some airports not doing that much actually. But if there is a broader guideline which mandates people to do that, everybody will do, everybody will invest actually. There should be some platform in the aviation sector where all these best practices can be, a repository kind of a stuff actually, so that can be accessed or adapted by the other agencies or other entities who really interested to do that one. Coming back to the last point from my side actually, like, you know, one of the limitations in the aviation sector, people mostly focus on the aircraft and that sector. Aircraft movement area, runway, etc., etc. They forget about the other side, that is the land side. And the land side has got most of the problems, stopping people to access the terminal, stopping people to operate at all. Or maybe a major disaster risk happens on the land side, then somewhere it's clueless actually like that. Right. So it should be taken as in its totality that airport aviation and thereafter preparations or planning happening and making it a little bit of mandatory with a kind of a broader guideline, which will help everybody to do same thing and a better way.
All right.
In the interest of time, I'm just summing up like that actually.
Thank you so much. And we have managed to come to the last question towards Annika. And Annika, again, the big picture scenario from you. what are the sort of climate impacts, the broader
Yes.
climate impacts, and not only just the climate events, but the impacts of the climate events that you foresee in the future? And how can the public and private sector come together in the future? So basically what I'm asking is, what sort of trends do you see in terms of collaboration between public and private sectors to meet these challenges of the future?
Yes, happy to take that question. I mean, as you have said before, transport infrastructure is central to our society and economy, and it's literally the backbone of that connects everything together, moving freight, goods, people, allowing us to live in a global world. Thus, disruptions have a direct impact on the economy and society, so inhibited or delayed connectivity hinders production or operation of companies, but also restricts, and I think that is super important, access to basic services such as healthcare, food, education, and in case of disaster striking, even emergency response. And let me give you two examples. It's one on economic impact. Following the Thailand flood in 2011, hard disk production was decreased by 30% for 6 months as the supply chain was broken. And one example for societal impact, when Hanoi was struck by a flood in 2008, 70% of its population was unable to get access to healthcare services due to the road disruption, ultimately resulting in a significant increase of diseases. And as you can see, I mean, the impacts are very real. They are existing in real life and already happening and ultimately affecting people, their livelihoods and quality of life. And as impacts affect both society and economy, the private sector has a role to play and needs to come together with the public sector to build resilience. And by requirement of the first global goal on adaptation at COP28, all countries need to create national adaptation plans, which integrate all levels of the government and all relevant sectors to build a comprehensive view. And the National Adaptation Plan and further subsequent regional plans need to include an infrastructure perspective. And for infrastructure specifically, it is super crucial to build resilient infrastructure life cycle from design to construction to operation and maintenance. We collaborated with UN high-level champions and published a report on this specific point, life cycle management of resilience. And result of this systematic and structured planning across all levels of the country is a portfolio of projects. And I mean, someone has to implement it, and this will only happen in very joint action across the board. And in the end, companies also need to understand their own exposure and vulnerability across the life cycle and build data-based adaptation resilience strategies, including an actionable solution portfolio. So everyone has a role to play, and I think the basis has been laid at COP28 that we all start to engage very structured and very systematically in a joint action.
Thank you, Annika. So, I mean, super intense, super insightful discussion, and what I mean, just to wrap up, I think what we heard was a focus on multi-pronged approach in the sense of addressing the capacities of both public sector, private sector, having instruments, having platforms, but also contractual solutions like putting contractual provisions that will at least mandate the private sector concessionaires to build resilience. And the most important statement that I heard in the discussion was investments is already happening. There's no new investment that you, that's limited new investment that you need to make in resilience per se. But basically you have to design the existing investment that's happening to meet the resilience goals. And there are various ways that we heard today during our panel discussion. Do we have time for 2 questions? Kiran, do we have time for 2 questions? Okay, just 2 questions then. All right, we have 2 hands raised.
Okay. Thank you, Chet, for giving us the opportunity to share a bit of our insights. So I am Sukaria, I am from the Mauritius, small island located in the Indian Ocean. So coming back to resilient transport projects and systems, we'd like to mention these following points. We have observed that by investing in resilient road transport systems, through construction, of course, at the end, we have created new risk. While looking at addressing a problem, we are creating new risks. Mainly, these new risks are flooding, which goes down to the community, affecting the community. This is one. Second, in terms of the drainage works, we've seen that again, it creates problem, flooding. You tamper with natural water courses, especially in small island developments like ours, and all the investment you are making in the resilient infrastructure, at the end, when you are going to face the extreme weather event, then you realize that, okay, simple flooding is affecting everything. Everything is blocked. And once, in terms of obstruction, we also have the tendency to have a lot of vegetation on both sides, trees and all that. And we are vulnerable to cyclones. And whenever we are being impacted to cyclones, trees fall on the trees, on the roads, and everything gets obstructed, yep, including the power network, which flows across. Everything is interconnected, and everything goes down. We have also roads. What we have realized, if we address all these interconnected risks, we'll be able to have a very quick recovery of our socio-economic activities, linking the port, the airport, the critical facilities, the services, the emergency services, the hospitals, the schools. Everything is interconnected.
Yeah. Thank you.
So that's,
yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's a very important point, and I think that's what the philosophy of CDRI's work as well, the systemic approach towards resilience. And while you rightly said, the drainage network, the transport infrastructure asset is not operating in a vacuum. It's connected to the drainage system, maybe the electrical system, maybe the street lights won't work, and all that. But I think that's a longer discussion as well in terms of how the systemic resilience can be built with transport at the center of it. And I'll be happy to discuss the same with you in the future. But because we have limited time, can we move on to the next question?
Yeah, sure. My question is to Ms. Jain. I think the issue is that PPPs are performance-based contract, and performance or goals over a long period of time on infrastructure resilience, that has to be handled. The 30-year contract, we don't know, uncertain is uncertain. So how do we really define? Because I saw many contracts where the entire risk has been passed on to government. Even force majeure is not defined. I will not name the country because I've worked in many countries. And at the same time, in many places, its force majeure is so general that it actually doesn't cover anything. It's just
a quick response from Jen on how do we measure the performance of the concessionaire on resilience performance.
For this question, I think this is at the heart
Jen,
of
if you're talking, you're on mute.
Okay. Sorry for the audio quality.
Jen, we can't hear you.
You can hear.
Sorry.
I don't know. So I unmuted myself. So
yeah. Now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, indeed, I think this is a really. Thank you for the question. This is at the heart of the problem. Actually, how do we really measure these risks and incorporate the performance? But this requires a really long conversation. We are working very closely with the procurement colleagues, how we can really design this long-term contract and assign the responsibility. And in the instance of the events occurrence. So I think the fundamental thing is there has to be the agreement of what are the future risks that we want to be prepared against. So that definition will need to take place. And when those incidences occur, the focus has to be the minimizing the impact and minimizing the negative impact on the condition of the infrastructure. So there has to be the boundaries drawn that is based on the climate data and other information. And that is the foundation of it. And then the contractual measure also through the procurement, right? So if you have disclosed clear underlying information about the risks that we want to protect against, and then we go through the procurement process. And the market, the private sector would respond to that parameters. What are the measures and level of performance they will commit to keep up at what price, at what cost. So with that information, market response would be the expressed willingness to pay from the private sector against the performance that is defined. So this is still an early stage of the experiment. A lot of work needs to be done from the technical side of it, and procurement side of it, and contract management and performance management side of it. So yes, I think that's a very, very good point, and we need to continue working towards this.
Thanks, Jen.
Can I add a footnote?
Yes.
2 points. There's an interesting issue to tackle, which is the uncertainties of climate change. We don't know whether we're going to end up at 1.5 warming, 2, 2.5.
Yeah.
And therefore that affects the risk profile that
Yes.
this infrastructure is going to face. So that needs to be taken into account so that the design of the infrastructure can be adaptive, can be changed in the most economical way, and that's where the innovation of the private sector comes in. Second, then review and renegotiation of those conditions becomes really important, and you need to put the clause, if you're going to have 30 years, every 5 years, what is the new data, what is the new analysis, what are we seeing the risk in that process?
And
then
recalibrate the
precisely, and therefore it becomes practical, but that doesn't happen frequently in this type of contract. And finally, the whole issue that this is a systemic issue, and therefore you can have the best resilience of your infrastructure. If there's other factors that are changing that process, you need to figure out how to deal with those. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Just sort of adding one small point into that one, what we call progressive calibration of issues actually like that. You cannot identify a risk for after 25 years or something like that. Every 5 years, you already mentioned that one. More than that, what I wanted to club both the points actually and say that the issue is actually who is listening to whom. That's the main issue, okay? Before establishing or executing an infrastructure, it is the job of the scientists or who are concerned to identify whether that is suitable to do there. Then the political interest or economic interest, nothing should come. Let them do their job. They will say that, yeah, this is the good place to do the infrastructure. After that, who should be listening to whom? Then again, coming it into the implementing people. That's actually the designer and the construction team. When the construction happens, finance team comes and screw them. Say that one, no money. Then automatically they will compromise that one. Correct, no? So don't intervene there. Let them do their job. After that, operation happens. When the operations are there, process, procedures, strategies, everything is required. That time, again, strategist comes into multiple politicians, multiple things comes into, then they are not. So what I mean to say, listen, who is listening to whom, and get influenced. Yeah. That defines the short this of the resilience as something like that.
Listen to the science people, that's the message. But it's extremely complicated context, and maybe it's a challenge for CDRI to solve. But that's the end of this discussion. Thank you so much for being part of this panel, and
thank you, Shobik. I think the panel was just getting warmed up. As we draw near to the conclusion of this session, very formally, I would just like to extend our deepest gratitude to our esteemed panelists for their invaluable contributions. May I request the moderator, Mr. Shobik, to present certificates of our appreciation to each of the panelists. We will also share virtual certificates soon to our virtual participants. And now it remains for me to thank you, Shoubik. A certificate from ICDRI to you. Thank you once again to the members of the audience, the moderators, our excellent panelists. Thank you very much. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.